Thank you, and thank you for coming, for caring about these issues, and thank you, I take it, for caring about this particular issue. The question before us is God anti-gay. And I'm sure for virtually every single one of us in the room, this is not a cultural issue, this is not a societal issue, this is about people. It's an issue about people that we know and love very dearly. Most of us, if not all of us, will have someone in our close orbit who identifies as LGB or as same-sex attracted. And so when we think about a topic like sexuality, we're thinking about folks that we know, folks that are very close to us. And it may well be in a crowd this size, there'll be a number of us for whom this is a very personal issue too. And that is certainly the case for me. The only romantic or sexual feelings I've ever had have been towards other men. I didn't choose for that to be the case. I didn't sort of wake up one day, aged 14, and think, I think life would be more interesting if I liked guys rather than girls. Nor have I been made that way by other people. I grew up in a very happy, stable family background. It just happened as I was growing up, I became aware that my attractions were for men and not for women. It took me a while to twig that. If you get to know me well, you'll know that I'm slow at the best of times. And so it actually took me a few years to kind of really recognize what was going on with my own sexuality. That the first kind of hint was when I was about the age of 14. My best friend at school had just started dating a girl and was telling the rest of us about this. And everyone was kind of congratulating him and cheering him on. And I remember just feeling really crushed. At that stage, I hadn't sort of consciously thought of my friend in a sexual kind of way. But the thought that he was now very intimate with somebody else left me feeling very vulnerable and threatened. And over the next couple of years, I began to realize I was just developing in a slightly different way to most of my friends. I was at an all-boys secondary school, and therefore the only two things we ever talked about were sport and women. I can't throw a ball to save my life. I don't know if this is scientifically possible or not, but I'm fairly sure it's true. But I think my center of gravity is outside my body. Okay, anything involving coordination or balance, and I'm no good. So I wasn't much good on that front. And I wasn't much good, as it turns out, on the talking about women front either. Friends of mine at school would often say, "So is anyone you like? Who are you after at the moment?" I would try and change the subject. And if that didn't work, and I'm not proud of this, I would occasionally make someone up. So yes, there's a girl I like, and I'd think to myself, quick, think of a girl's name. Denise. I like a girl called Denise. And the follow-up would come, "Oh, do we know her?" So I'd have to think, no, you don't. No, you don't know her. No, she's not from round here. She's from Norway, actually, so you won't ever know her or have come across her. It's a slightly tragicomic period in my life. But I remember very distinctly traveling back from school one day, standing at a bus stop, waiting for the bus. I was 17 years old. I don't know why this revelation came to me at a bus stop, but that's what happened. And I remember thinking to myself for the very first time, I think I'm gay. I think that's what this is. This was a good 25 years ago, so the issue wasn't on the radar in the way that it is now. It would be a very obvious conclusion to reach much more quickly, I'm sure, today. And at that stage, I was applying for universities, and I remember thinking, I could run with this at university. This is going to age me horrifically, but this was just before the internet, if you can imagine that. And so it was conceivable that I could be one thing at university and something quite different back home. Okay, we weren't Instagramming every waking moment of our lives at that point. But in between that kind of thinking and actually going to university, something else happened. A Christian friend invited me to his church's youth ministry. The time he invited me, I had literally nothing else to do. So I thought I would go along. And I heard there something I had never heard in my life. I'd grown up assuming that if the Christianity kind of meant that if you were really obnoxious, God would like you and then you'd go to heaven. I've seen a little bit of evidence in certain Christians around me to support that theory. But what I heard in this church for the very first time was that Christianity is not about God rewarding good people. It's about God forgiving bad people. And over the coming weeks, I began to realize I was someone God had come for. And I began to realize that what the issue was for me wasn't primarily my sexuality, it was my unbelief that I needed to turn from. And so I became a Christian around the time I turned 18, and I then had to think through the question, well, what does this now mean for my sexuality? What am I going to do with that now that I'm a Christian? And in one sense, the principle for me was very clear, that the Jesus I had just put my trust in was a Jesus I knew I could trust. He was someone who had laid down his life, and I thought, if someone does that for me, in the way in which Jesus shows us that he has, I know I can follow him wherever he leads me. And I had no idea at the time what that might look like or what that might involve. And so I thought, okay, what does Jesus think about sexuality? That's the question I was asking. I'm going to try and help us with that now. But before I knew the answer, or what I've come to understand as the answer to that question, you've got to know, and I hope many of us will know this, the Jesus I was asking that question about is a Jesus who knows me much better than I know myself. A Jesus who loves me much more than I love myself. A Jesus who is more committed to my joy than I am. And therefore, whatever he was going to say, I knew I could trust. Well, two quick things Jesus does say on this issue. There is a myth going around at the moment. It's fairly pervasive. The myth is that Jesus is neutral when it comes to issues of sexual ethics. Let me just show you two quick passages. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 15, Jesus is having a debate with some religious leaders. And he says these words to them. I was going to try and do them from memory, but every time I do that, I end up making up scripture, which generally isn't a good thing in the Christian life. Jesus says these words to these particular people. He says, "For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person." Really important passage. Jesus says there are things that do mean we're not fit for God's presence. But in contrast to the prevailing wisdom of his day, the problem wasn't outside. The problem is inside. Jesus says it is out of the heart that come the things that separate us from God. And he gives us not an exhaustive list, but just a sampling of what some of those things look like. Jesus says that we all have the same spiritual infection. We're all by nature turned away from God, and there are lots of different symptoms. And Jesus lists some of them, and he includes the phrase sexual immorality, which is the translation of a Greek word, porneia. If that word is ringing a very faint bell, it's because it's where we get the word pornography from. And at the time of Jesus, it was a word that simply meant any sexual behavior outside of marriage. Jesus says it's sinful. Just a couple of chapters later, in Matthew 19, Jesus is having another discussion with the same sort of people. This time, the presenting issue is divorce. They say to Jesus, "Can you divorce your wife for any reason? Is that okay?" Some leaders were teaching that very thing. And Jesus answers with some very, very significant words. This is Matthew 19, verses 4 to 6. He says, "Have you not read?" Always a good question for a Pharisee, because they were proud of how well they knew the Bible. Jesus says, "Have you not read?" and then quotes the first page of the Bible. Did he get as far as Genesis 1 as Pharisees? If you meet a Pharisee, that's a great put down for them. Have you not read, by the way? Jesus says, have you not read? And then he cites Genesis 1, that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Very significant passage. Jesus is asked about divorce. He answers by talking about marriage, and in order to talk about marriage, Jesus has to talk about gender. Okay, follow Jesus' logic. Have you not heard that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. In other words, Jesus is saying, it is because God has made us male and female that we have this thing called marriage. For Jesus, marriage is predicated on our sexual difference as men and women. Now, I'm not just saying this because I'm a coward and like to avoid conflict, although I am and I do. My job is not to persuade you that this is my job is to show you Jesus says this. And so it is Jesus we have to reckon with when it comes to this kind of teaching. It's worth bearing in mind that the teaching of Jesus on marriage has been unpopular in every single age. Well, Jesus unpacks that one flesh thing. The disciples slightly freak out in response and say to him, if that's the case of a man and his wife, it might be better not to marry. Interesting, isn't it? When Jesus shows his view of marriage, the response is, I might give it a miss, actually. Sounds a bit like commitment. Well, Jesus responds to them by saying, he starts talking about eunuchs. Eunuchs at the time were people who were celibate for one reason or another. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you want to miss marriage and skip marriage, that's fine, but he then highlights celibacy. So as far as Jesus is concerned, the godly alternative to heterosexual marriage is to be celibate, to be sexually abstinent, to be chaste, to use some old-fashioned words. And so I began to realize, even as a fairly new Christian, that if I was going to follow Jesus with integrity, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to kind of fuel and act on the kind of homosexual feelings that I was experiencing. And so I had a choice. I could just ditch Jesus and think, well, frankly, it can't be worth it. I could say, well, I could sort of try and make Jesus sort of agree with what I feel like doing. Some people do that. I could try, if you squint one eye a bit and turn the Bible to a funny angle, it might mean that he's saying something different. And try and sort of somehow mash the teaching of Jesus into what I wanted him to say. Or I could trust him. And my decision was to trust him. Which to many people today would sound absurd. I mean, ridiculous. I heard somebody say recently that, celibate people, they're a bit like unicorns. I'd heard of them. I never actually thought I would meet one. But something else Jesus said helped me with that decision. You see, the message of Christianity is that all of us have a problem with our orientation. As I got to know the message of Jesus, I realized actually the orientation that was problematic was not so much sexual as spiritual. The message of Jesus is that none of us is naturally lined up with God's ways. We're out of sync with him, and that touches on every area of life, including our sexuality. And so it's so important for us to know this, but actually that the teaching of Christianity is that every single one of us is broken in our sexuality. The effect of that not being in sync with God means that our desires are all a bit twisted, a bit disordered in one way or another. And for every one of us, that includes our sexual desires. And so if I can put it this way, that there is no one who is straight. Okay, all of us are skewed in our sexuality. Some of us in a sort of same-sex, homosexual kind of direction, others perhaps in a bi direction, others in a heterosexual, opposite-sex kind of direction. But actually that the Bible treats us all the same. And therefore, for anyone to follow Jesus just in this one area of life is going to be costly. It's going to be involving saying no to at least some very deep sexual desires and longings. No one gets everything their way sexually. Actually, the teaching of Jesus puts a constraint on all of us. So it wasn't as if Jesus is saying to all the heterosexual people, well, you guys get a pass, off you go, enjoy. And then to all the folks like me who are maybe same-sex attracted or bi, Jesus says, well, I'm sorry, but you guys are just going to have to. There is a constraint on all of us. There is a cost on all of us in this one area of life. And if we're familiar with the teaching of Jesus, actually that won't surprise us, because Jesus said of discipleship as a whole, he said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For anyone, Jesus is saying, for anyone to be one of his disciples is going to involve saying a radical no to self. The self that we think we are. The identity we've finessed over the years. All of it has to be given to Jesus. Somebody once came up to me after church and said, yes, but the gospel's harder for you, isn't it? It goes right against who you are. And I remember thinking, well, I'm not sure my sexual feelings are who I am, to start with. We can talk about that. But secondly, if you think the gospel's been easy for you, if it's just kind of slotted into life without any kind of difficulty, I'm not sure it's the gospel of this Jesus you've received. There is a cost to me in following Jesus, but the point is it is one example of the same cost for all of us. And so if we think the cost of discipleship is too high for our LGB friends, actually we think it's too high for anyone. But is it worth it? All I may have done so far is convince us, actually it's worse than I thought it was. And that's worse for everyone, so thank you for that. That's cheery, isn't it? Is it worth it? Yes, is the short answer to that question. I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear me say. Let me share a passage that is really important on this. It's in Mark chapter 10. We've just had the rich man leaving Jesus sad. Peter says to Jesus, hey, we've left everything and followed you. Peter, the bragger. We're the guys, we've done it. We're the heroes, we've left everything. And Jesus says to Peter, truly I say to you, okay, that's Jesus' code for what I'm about to say really matters. One day people will embroider this saying on cushions and put it on inspirational posters. It's that kind of thing I'm about to say. He says, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. Jesus assumes we will leave things to follow him. He assumes the most costly things will be relational. Some people literally do have to leave their entire relationship network to follow Jesus. Not everyone, thankfully, but some do. And yet Jesus can say, even in this life, it is worth it. Because whatever we leave to follow him, we receive back far more from him. It is never a bad deal to follow Jesus. And again, he casts it primarily in relational terms. What we leave, he replaces in godly kind and far greater measure, and he says, we will receive houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands. Jesus is saying that in him we will receive community. We will receive family. We will receive intimacy. It should be the case that any disciple of Jesus can say, however much they've had to leave behind, they can say, do you know what? I now have more intimacy in my life and not less. I have more community in my life and not less. Which has implications actually for a lot of our churches, doesn't it? Whether we are providing that sense of community and intimacy. In our culture, we've really mashed intimacy and sex into one another. And so we can't conceive of any intimacy that isn't ultimately sexual intimacy. We hear previous generations talk about friendship and the depth of friendship, and we roll our eyes and think, oh, well, they must have been gay or something. But the Bible shows us you can have a lot of sex in life and no intimacy. It also shows us you can have a lot of intimacy in your life and not be having sex. Actually, there's a far broader way in which we can experience and enjoy intimacy than purely the romantic and sexual relationship. Jesus offers that in the life of his people. He also offers us identity because your sexual feelings are not the core of who you are. And to say they are actually is bad news because it in effect says to someone, unless you are sexually or romantically fulfilled, your life will never be full. And yet the most complete and fully human person who ever walked this earth was not married, was not in a romantic relationship, and never had sex. The key to life is not found in those things, good gifts though they are when enjoyed in the right context. No, there is something deeper. And with this I'll finish. Some very famous words of Jesus. He said on one occasion, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. In other words, Jesus offers us satisfaction. Trouble is, we hear Jesus say, I am the bread of life, and we think, oh, well, that's lovely. I like bread. I went for lunch with a friend of mine just recently, and the waiter said, would you like any bread for the table? And we said, no, we're fine for now, thanks. And so when we hear Jesus say, I'm the bread of life, we think Jesus is saying, would Sir like a bit of religion for the table? But at the time of Jesus, if you didn't have bread, you died. No bread meant no life. And so when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, he is saying, I am to your soul what bread is to a starving stomach. I am the only one who can bring true satisfaction. That when Jesus is at the center, life will work better, and when anything else is, it won't. So there are times when I think, oh, I'd love to be married to a wife and have some kids. Other times, actually, I'm well aware that's not always easy. But the real win for me, and for any of us if we know Christ, is to get more of him. Because he is the one who satisfies. So even in this life, it is worth it to follow Jesus, because in him we do find intimacy. We find a true identity, and we find in Jesus ultimate satisfaction. Well, I'm going to pause there. I'd love to hear some of your questions and slightly less to try and answer them.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for your questions on Pigeonhole. I gather that there have been no questions written down on the cards. If you do end up wanting to write your question down, feel free to do that and pass it to a member of the team. But otherwise, I'll just work off Pigeonhole. And Sam, as you can see, there are quite a few. Can we just work through as many as we can in the time that we've got? Maybe start with the first one, and I'll just read it out so that everyone can see it. Many people will say that we do not choose our sexual orientation. Did God make some people homosexual?
Thank you. I agree with the kind of premise of the question, that I've not met someone who did choose their sexual kind of patterns of attraction and orientation and all the rest of it. What we need to bear in mind as Christians is we can't just read off from all of the desires and inclinations we have now in any area of life. We can't just read off those things and say, well, God must have made me with all of those things and therefore they must all be good. Actually, we know that. When I'm behind the wheel of my car, I find it very natural to be irritable. That's no effort. I didn't choose that. It's just part of the way I'm wired. Now, it wouldn't be right for me to say, because that's natural to me and unchosen, therefore God has made me irritable and therefore everyone must affirm my irritability. Although if you don't cut me up, I would appreciate that in the traffic. And the same is true, and this is the case for all of us with our sexuality. We can't just say, well, my sexual desires, whatever they might happen to me, must be how God made me, and therefore I must be able to say yes to all of them. All of us are a mixture of, as we've been hearing, of both being made in the image of God and yet as those who have turned from God. And therefore we've slightly warped that image. We're slightly skewed. We're like one of those mirrors that's gone a bit kind of distorted. That the reflection is no longer perfect. And so there will be much that we can look at in our lives and think, yep, that is evidence that I'm made in God's image. There'll be many other things where we have to say, I'm not sure that's a sign of how God has made me. It may be a sign of how sin has twisted me. And so I hope that helps.
Great, thank you, Sam. The next question says, many people will say that, oh, it's just that they've moved. Okay, sorry. If a gay couple got together before they were Christians, what should they do once they become Christians? And I wonder if I can ask you to take it from two angles. There might be some people in the room who are Christians wanting to walk the journey with their non-Christian friends and are asking a pastoral question. I wonder if you could address that, but then I wonder if you could also address it from the perspective of someone in the room who isn't a Christian, has this as a theme in their lives, and they're kind of wondering, look, if I become a Christian, what are the implications for me in my lifestyle? Could you take it from both angles, please?
Sure, I will try to. I guess the answer is the same for all of us, that whatever we come to Christ as, and with whatever kind of baggage and background and situations already in place, for all of us, what we need to do is to give over everything to Jesus. And actually, one of the ways we can kind of define a Christian is someone who is letting Jesus now run their life. It's basically saying, you know more about running my life than I do. Here are the controls. And so for all of us, that means we're provisionally saying, Jesus, whatever you want and wherever you lead, I'm trusting you with. And for all of us, that will involve some painful decisions. As Jesus has said, that the cost of following him is is at times will feel very high. It will feel like we're denying ourselves and taking up our cross. Jesus says in the next verse that actually if we lose our lives to Christ, we will gain them, which tells us at times following Jesus will feel like he's taking your life from you. And if you're a disciple of Jesus and you haven't felt that yet, you will. At some point, Jesus will put his finger on something that feels sacred to you and he'll say, I need you to trust that to me. That is a feature of discipleship for all of us. When it comes to a particular relationship we might be in when we come to Christ, I think that the principle again is, what is the healthy kind of biblical footing to put this existing relationship onto? If its current state is something we know Jesus would not affirm. That can look different for different situations. For some heterosexual couples who aren't married but have been together for a while, sometimes actually the right thing to do for their discipleship is to put their relationship on the biblical footing of marriage. There are other times when a romantic relationship actually, if we're going to be following Jesus, needs to be perhaps thought of more in terms of a very deep friendship than as a romantic or a sexual partnership. The sign that we're Christian is not that we get all of that pinned down and sorted out on day one. The sign that we're a Christian is we are willing to say, if Jesus leads me in a certain direction, I'll follow him there. Like if we're preparing someone for baptism at our church, that the principle is you want to make sure someone's dead before you bury them. And so the question is, are you willing to follow Jesus wherever he takes you? And it's not my job to then prescribe, here are the 17 things I think you need to now do immediately. But actually, if our heart is willing to be led by Christ, we will be willing to go wherever that might be, which might be changing a relationship from a romantic one to a deep friendship one. For someone on the other side of that kind of experience who's thinking, right, I might be interested in following Jesus one day, but I'm gay, and what's that going to look like? Again, it will be the same dynamic as it is for all of us. There will be aspects of following Jesus that feel as though you're losing who you are, that feel like you're losing life. And from this side of the process, it just looks like loss. But Jesus actually says it's as we lose our life to him, we gain it. And that the testimony, I hope, of any of us who is a Christian is that actually it's as we give those things to Christ, as we say no to self, actually we become who we were meant to be. We become more the person God had in mind when he made us. And it's very paradoxical, but we find we gain life, we gain who we are, actually as we go through that process of yielding some of the deepest things in us to Jesus.
Sam, you've touched on these themes already, and I'm just wondering if you have anything that you'd want to kind of add or kind of expand on. But there's a question, in fact, the next question with the number of votes says, Matthew 5:28 says it's adultery to look at people lustfully. Is it the case not only that gay people shouldn't have sex, but also not to lust after other men or women with their eyes or mind? Now, I'm aware, of course, it's not just gay people, but any person of any stripe or kind. But I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about this distinction that we tend to make between here are the boundaries, here's the set of actions I must or must not do, but this is okay, or where are the lines we can stray or not? And if you could speak to us a little bit about that.
Sure, this is a feature of Jesus' teaching that we like to try to pin down what God wants of us into certain do's and don'ts. And so we think, as long as I'm not doing that or saying that or being there, I'm kind of obedient. That was certainly the kind of religious culture into which Jesus was doing his ministry. And therefore, one of the challenges of Jesus' teaching is that he doesn't merely stop at our behavior, he looks at our attitude and at our hearts. Which is actually where a place like the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says it's not enough to not to have killed someone. I mean, That's a start, that's good. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need to not have hateful feelings towards other people. And in the domain of sexual behavior, Jesus again says it's not enough that you've not committed a sexual sin in kind of action. That's necessary, it's not sufficient. Jesus says we mustn't actually have sexually immoral thoughts towards other people. And again, that's the case for all of us, which is why there are going to be times when any of us, if we're following Jesus, is going to have to say no to some of our quite deeply ingrained sexual desires. So that in that sense, the standard applies to all of us. It's not enough to say, well, I've got these attractions, but as long as I don't physically kind of get into bed with someone, everything else going on in my mind is fine. No, Jesus actually says we've got to honor him in our mind and in our hearts, which is one of the reasons why Christianity can't be a case of be good enough and then God will let you in, because the goodness Jesus calls us to is far beyond what we can merely get to just by our own human efforts. It needs a change of heart, which only he can give us. And so one of the things we find as we go on in the Christian life, and it's a slow old process for many of us, is that God begins to change our moral taste buds. So it's a bit like, I love drinking orange juice, always drank orange juice, love orange juice. If I brush my teeth and then drink orange juice, it tastes different. The juice hasn't changed, but my taste buds have. And it's the same with our relationship with sin. We can still sin after we become followers of Jesus, but the grace he's put into our lives makes sin taste different. And so we do fight it as believers. It's still there. Those temptations are still present. But actually we find that over time, Jesus begins to make us love his ways more than our own ways.
Thank you, Sam. That's it. That's all we've got time for in terms of Q&A. Please thank Sam with me again for that amazing session.